So the Nakba, as we mentioned, was 750,000 people that were displaced from their homes, forcibly displaced, ethnically cleansed, and about 15,000 people were killed. The numbers could be way higher, but this was what was reported at the time. We know villages and towns like Tantura, Deir Yassin, where there was mass casualties and executions. And my father's village, Kanir, they were able to escape that because they left before the Zionist gangs actually arrived to take over. So that was a decision that many families took. And that's why some people ask, why were so many Palestinians displaced before they were attacked? And that's because they saw what had happened in hundreds of villages across Palestine. So they took the decision to protect their families and young children.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
So they arrived at Jenin. And what's really interesting about Jenin is probably one of the most untold stories of the Nakba and of 1948. A man called Omar Ali Bayaktar. Yeah. So Omar Ali Bayaktar was the general of the Iraqi army that defended Jenin. And it was a stunning victory, actually. They defeated the Haganah forces that attempted to take the city. And Jenin is a very important city because it's right at the beginning of the West Bank. So taking Jenin would have opened up the rest of the West Bank to occupation. So there were 44 Iraqi martyrs. And on the right-hand side of my screen, what you see there is the plaque of the 44 Iraqi soldiers who'd fallen in Jenin, the martyrs. And they call it Maqbara Shuhada, the graveyard of the martyrs of Jenin. It was actually a Palestinian family who gave up the land for those martyrs to be buried on their land. And to this day, you will still see the Iraqi flag side by side with the Palestinian flag, because people really recall and value the sacrifice of the Iraqi army in defending Jenin. Now, what was very interesting is Omar Ali Bayaktar knew how weak the Zionist forces were, and he knew that they had been propped up all these years, and actually they were no match to the trained armies. So he actually asked for permission to take Haifa. So if you look at the map of Palestine, Haifa's on the coast. So if you take Palestine, you've literally cut Palestine into half. There is no really a viable Zionist state. So he asked for permission to move his forces to take Haifa. He was prevented from doing so. So it was the Iraqi defense minister at the time called Saleh Zaki, who actually forbade permission. He forbid him to actually move his forces in the direction of Haifa. And the Arab women, the Palestinian women, used to sing a folk song. They used to say, Saleh Zaki, Maku Amr, Maku Amr. What is wrong with you, Saleh Zaki? Why did you not give permission to fight? Because they realized that this would have been the chance to actually end this kind of illegal occupation right at the outset. So it's a really interesting story. So my dad lived there for about 2 to 3 years. Initially, they lived in a cave, would you believe it? And then they lived in the forest. They used to sell firewood. So going from a very prosperous, very comfortable life in Kanir, now as internally displaced refugees, selling herbs and firewood to any of the local towns and villages around Jenin. And he mentioned something very interesting. He said, had it not been for the Iraqi army, their life would have been miserable because they had food with them. And he remembers taking my auntie, who at the time was a little baby, to the Iraqi army. And there was a Kurdish officer that he remembers who would give them like creams and treatments for some skin conditions that they had at the time. So it was definitely something that they look upon fondly in terms of what the Iraqi army did in terms of protecting Jenin, but also in terms of the servitude and the service that they offered to the refugees who lived in Jenin during that time. So moving on, they ended up in a refugee camp called Nur Shemes, which is right next to Tulkarem, which is a kind of a major town in the West Bank. And Nur Shemes, and these are pictures that have just come out during this kind of last 17 months, has been under attack and is currently under occupation. So my family now have been forced out of their homes in Nur Shemes and now are living with family either in Tulkarem or in the outskirts of Nur Shemes. But the camp itself now is under occupation. They've destroyed dozens of homes and they've killed dozens of people, including children and women, just in Nur Shemes. We're not talking about Gaza here. So Nur Shemes was actually a British prison during British Mandate Palestine. So when we used to visit Nur Shemes and we would look at the bars in the house, they used to be on the windows, and we used to ask, why is there bars in the house? You know, like prison bars. And the reason being is that it was actually a converted British prison. And many of those Palestinians who tried to resist British occupation and also tried to resist what they knew was going to be an inevitable Zionist occupation of Palestine would end up in prisons like this. So they remain there ever since. So Nur Shemis is now kind of the de facto home for us within the West Bank and Palestine, ever since the Nakba in 1948. So this is like possibly another 4 or 5 refugee camps have been destroyed in the same way in Jenin and in other places across the West Bank. But there's constant raids by the Israeli occupation forces in all the cities of the West Bank. So unlike the severity and the kind of the bombing that we see in Gaza, it's still a very horrific occupation that we witness in the West Bank, and has been like that since 1967, when the West Bank fell to the Zionist occupation. Moving on, this is a picture of my cousin, Rafat Hussein, who was the first martyr in the family. So there were 10 martyrs in the family now. He was the first to be killed in 1976. And actually, the anniversary of his death is actually happening in the next few days. It was the 30th of March, 1976. It was called the Land Day. And this is when 6 Palestinians were killed by the Israeli occupation. And he was the first to be martyred in the family. His brother Faisal died soon after, fighting to defend Lebanon. And since that time, several more cousins and children of my cousins have been martyred in Palestine. And this is quite a common story amongst Palestinians. Very rarely will you find a Palestinian family who hasn't got martyrs within them, because naturally many of them resisted occupation. It's almost unheard of not to have a prisoner within the family. So there's dozens and dozens of Palestinian.
Something I've noticed in the Western press, the Western media, is that when we have Israeli hostages, we know what they look like, we know their names, we even know a lot about their lives, about their family, and it's very personalized. When it comes to Palestinian hostages or martyrs, we never know who they are. They're just anonymous kind of people who are Palestinian, so they're almost of much lesser value, it seems, in terms of the way we speak of people. And this is the same whether it's the BBC or Fox. It is always the same. The very personalized individual attention given to the name and the personality and the family of an Israeli hostage. But when it comes to the Palestinians, the victims often of occupation and brutality and ethnic cleansing, we don't know who these people are. We don't know their names. And there's a shocking double standard, which is just routinely there in all the media, as far as I can see.
Yeah, and as you say, it continues to today. How many Palestinian children have been killed? It's just become a statistic. And that statistic is horrifying when we're thinking about 20,000 plus children that have been murdered. But really, who remembers the names? A few cases have broken through the kind of mainstream media blockade almost to try and get the truth out. We've got examples of Reem, the young girl who was murdered, and her grandfather who was also murdered recently, Khalid. And then you have this, other Hind, who was a 6-year-old who was murdered when 300 bullets were fired at the car that she was in with her family. So we barely hear of the names of maybe a few individuals, but in reality, it's a mass slaughter of a population that's taking place now.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's really important when we look at Palestine not to think of 1948 as the starting point, or not even the 2nd of November 1917, which is when the Balfour Declaration was made, because there was an event or events that were much more important that took place prior to this date that are often forgotten and not discussed. And one of those stories is the First Battle of Gaza. So the First Battle of Gaza took place in March 1917. British forces from Egypt attempted to take Gaza, and they were repelled by the Ottoman defenders. And it was quite a significant victory for the Ottomans. The casualties on the British side were about 6,000 versus just over 2,000 on the Ottoman side. So the British knew they had their hands full against the sick man of Europe, let's not forget, as the Ottomans were called at the time. And they returned in April of 1917 for their second encounter, the Second Battle of Gaza. But the Ottomans again routed the forces and actually were able to defend Gaza. So the casualties at that time, I believe, were about 7,000 to 8,000 on the British side and a couple of thousand on the Ottoman side. Now, the British realized this was not going to be easy now to take Gaza. They thought that maybe the Ottomans, known to be the sick man of Europe, known to be much weaker compared to their kind of glorious past, would be an easy kind of opponent to overwhelm. So what the British undertook after the Second Battle of Gaza was really an attempt to weaken Palestine by causing division and dissent across the Arab world, particularly in Jordan.
Divide and rule. We're very good at that.
Divide and rule.
In India as well.
Yeah. So this is an interesting picture here. So what you have is the image right at the top there of the train is the first train that came from the Hijaz Railway to Be'er Seba. Be'er Seba, which is now called Beersheba in Zionist-occupied Palestine, was a major kind of city and a location that the Ottomans used to defend Palestine. So it became like almost like a barracks for the Ottoman army. And they would use that city and the supplies that came from there to defend Gaza and other parts in other areas within Palestine. So, and the bottom picture is actually the opening of the train station in Be'er Seba. So the British actually wanted to weaken the Ottomans by disrupting the supply lines into Palestine, because they realized the Ottomans were going to defend Palestine. They were not going to just hand it over. So what you have is the Hijaz Railway that runs from Ottoman Turkey through Syria, through to Palestine, Jordan, and other areas within the Arabian Peninsula. So he went as far as to Medina, as we know. And there were other important areas such as Aqaba, which is a major port city within Jordan.
Famously.
So this was really the beginnings of the Arab revolt. So you have Lawrence of Arabia working with the Sharif of Mecca, Hussein ibn Ali, to weaken, as you said, to divide and rule the Muslim world. Unfortunately, many of the Arabs, but I would say in proportion, it's really important to remember, we're not talking about large numbers. And this is the case even now. It's not that you have wholesale treachery occurring in the Muslim world. It's unfortunately those in the positions of power that have abandoned the people of Palestine. And it was then the same thing. It was the people in power who saw an opportunity to try and kind of create their own kind of government. They were promised an Arab Khilafah, as many people know. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence between McMahon, who was, I think, the High Commissioner in Egypt at the time, and Hussein ibn Ali, was that they would promise them an Arab Khilafah, a whole swathe of land that would be under their rule. So Sharif of Mecca worked with Lawrence of Arabia and the British forces to weaken the Ottoman defenders. So actually these pictures, these photos were taken by myself 2 years ago, just before the genocide on Gaza. So this was in the summer of 2023. And the image on the left-hand side is actually a close-in shot of the Yarmouk bridge, where the Hijaz Railway crossed from Syria into Jordan. And as you can see, it's been blown up. So this is an area where the Hijaz Railway was blown up by those attempting to kind of create this disruption within Jordan. And the image on the right is within one of the castles in Aqaba. So Aqaba also fell to the Arab revolt. So these were two really instrumental elements of the victory of the Arab revolt, you could say, against the Ottomans in Jordan, because Aqaba was used to supply Ottoman forces, and so was the Hijaz Railway. And the Hijaz Railway was attacked in many places across Jordan. It wasn't just in Yarmouk, but that's just one example. So then the British came back in November of 1917 to take Gaza. And this time they were able to overwhelm it quite quickly. So within a couple of days, on the 1st and the 2nd of November, they pretty much secured their victory over Gaza. And Be'er Seba actually fell a day earlier, on the 31st of October 1917, because the British actually diverted troops there, knowing of its strategic importance. On the 7th of November, Allenby himself walked into Gaza. And it's really interesting that a lot of people are fixated with the date, the 2nd of November, 1917, because that's when the Balfour Declaration was made. But this is a really interesting clip, newspaper clip. The British captured the historic city of Gaza, and that actually occurred, obviously, in the early days of November. And it was on the 2nd of November, 1917, that the Balfour Declaration was made. So when people think of the Balfour Declaration as almost kind of a promise for a Jewish homeland, they have to remember that what the British needed to do first was actually take Palestine, to give that promise to the Jewish people that they would have their own homeland on the homes and the lands of Palestinians. So, it's really important to remember this part of history, the 1917 campaigns of the battles of Gaza. And now when we think of Gaza, that's kind of the last defense of Palestine. There's something quite, symbolic about that as well.